from Shalmaneser the third until Tiglath-Pileser the third. The king took the Eponine and was followed by the commander-in-chief Turtanu. After him came the palace herald Nagar-Ikali and the chief cupbearer Rab-Saki in an interchanging order. Fifth was the treasurer Messanu. After the four highest officials, the governors and provinces followed, headed by the governor of Assur, Sakin-Mati. A major change in the system can be seen during the reign of Sargon II, when the traditional sequence of the high officials as eponyms after the king was abandoned, and the Messenu was the only magnate to become eponym. Assur-Haddon was the first king not to take the eponymate, and during his reign the vizier Sakalu, the deputy vizier Sakalu Sanu, and the chief judge Sartanu appear as new officials gaining this status. It is important to note that these three officials had no provinces attached to the office, a clear deviation from the previous practice, as pointed out. The eponymate of the king started the cycle of the four highest officials. The king could, by not taking the eponymate at the beginning of his reign, avoid starting this cycle of the highest magnates. Abandoning the fixed sequence of eponyms increased the power of the king in deciding whom to appoint as eponyms, and enabled the ruler to include new officials or to reward loyalty. The rise of the two new officials, the chief of trade Rab-Kari La Abbasi, eponym of 657, and the chief tailor Rab-Kairi Malki Rami of 656 to the office of eponym during the early reign of Assurbanipal reflects the rewards of loyalty. Both La Abbasi and Milki Rami belong to the supporters of Assurbanipal. La Abbasi had shown loyalty to Assurbanipal during his accession, and the chief tailor Milki Rami as the official taking care of the royal insignia belonging to the close circle of the king. Milki Rami proved to be an important supporter of Assurbanipal, and he had a significant role during the revolt of Samuukin and Assurbanipal's campaign against Elam. The case of the chief treasurer of Sargon II, Assur, may well be used as an example for the importance of individual merit. His multifaceted activities are well known from the over 40 letters that can be attributed to him. He was eponym of 717 BCE, the year of the founding of the new capital, Dur-Sarukin, and was personally overseeing the building of the city. As chief treasurer, Assur was also involved in building projects in other cities, including the building of the Temple of Anu in Ashur, houses in Kalu, and the transportation of basalt steps in Nineveh. He was in charge of assigning valuable materials and of the transportation of cultic objects. Ashur held an important border province, the land of the treasurer, strategically placed on the border of Urartu. His contribution to the Urartu campaign must have been significant, as he was given the honor of delivering the so-called letter to the god Ashur in 714. Merits of Ashur are indeed impressive, and without the testimony of his letters, it would be impossible to believe that the extensiveness of his duties. When Ashurbanipal II reports on the festivities held for the inauguration of his new imperial capital at Kalu, he speaks of 69,574 people whom he provided with food and drink for 10 days. This account demonstrates the ability of the Assyrian king to organize the acquisition and preparation of thousands of cattle, sheep, game, birds, and fish, large amounts of grain, thousands of liters of beer and wine, various different types of vegetables, herbs, spices, and fruits, as well as honey, milk, and dairy products. The whole undertaking must have involved thousands of laborers and workers, with the king relying especially on his officials who delegated and coordinated the different operations and channeled the traffic of goods. These same administrative figures who organized the supply of food and drink for the royal household. Food consumption within the royal household can be basically divided into ordinary consumption. This is the daily meal. The extraordinary consumption on the occasion of festival banquets. While the daily meal was provided for the king and his inner circle, festival consumption involved a broader spectrum of participants, including the king's state officials who maintained their own households, as well as guests and envoys from abroad. Hence, Ashurbanipal lists as his guests 47,074 men and women from all over the empire, 5,000 envoys from around Polites, 16,000 inhabitants of Kalu, and 1,500 courtiers Zeraku of his palace to celebrate the new capital, Kalu. Similarly, Ashur-Haddon let his magnates, Lugal-Mes, and the people of his land, Un-Meskur-Ea, enjoy tables richly laden with food and drink after he had completed his review palace Inkel-Masarti, the palace that administers everything, as Gal-Sedua in Nineveh. These sumptuous banquets were accompanied by the performance of offerings to the gods, that is, The royal meal attended by the king's subjects was preceded by the divine meal. This sequence of events clearly expressed in the aforementioned account of Esarhaddon, who first let the gods of Assyria enter and consecrate his new palace before he invited his subjects for dinner. The regular delivery of divine leftovers, all over greater distances, to the king is by no means a unique practice in the ancient Near East. For instance, it is well known for the Neo-Babylonian period, although the daily meal of the king for the most part may have remained unaffected by cultic procedures in the temple and all through the large-scale consumption of offerings leftovers, following the correspondingly large-scale performance of offerings by the king's subjects took place only exceptionally or in greater intervals. The temple sphere was important for the food supply of the palace, owing to Assyria's abundance of pasture lands and cultivated lands. The royal household could rely to a great extent on the country's own production of edible goods for its maintenance. But it also benefited from foodstuffs entering the land as booty, tribute, and gifts, and obtained via trade. As for Assyria's own produce, the basic stages of the food supply were production, management, and preparation. First, meat, grain, legumes, vegetables, herbs, spices, and fruits were produced through animal husbandry, agriculture, and gardening, mainly in the countryside. Then followed the transfer of stables and storage facilities in local centers and the main cities, and the redistribution to kitchen facilities and all other establishments for the further processing, such as slaughtering, conserving, and final preparation, including cooking and baking. Depending on the type of food, a modified process was in operation. For example, cattle and poultry were fattened in the urban stables, while grapes were pressed and bottled already in the countryside, in regions northwest of the Assyrian heartland, with foodstuffs received from alternative channels. With the first stage obviously took place abroad, but the subsequent management and treatment must have been similar to what happened with the home-produced foodstuffs. These alternative channels were particularly important for procuring goods that were not available or scarce in Assyria, such as wine and olive oil. These, of course, were processed already before they had entered the Assyrian heartland. For the Neo-Assyrian period, we can observe a considerable number of administrative offices who were concerned with foodstuffs. I distinguish here between kitchen manager, who presides over food-related professions, in other words, chief cooks, and food managers who were concerned with a specific foodstuff, in other words, wine master, and grain managers who were in charge of storage facilities for grain and grain products. From among these officials, it is primarily the kitchen managers who, as their titles reveal, were attached to a specific institution or administrative sphere. Hence, apart from the royal household, also close relatives of the kitchen, crown prince, queen, queen's mother, provincial governors, temples, Asur temple, Ishtar temple, and cities could have their own kitchen managers. By contrast, the managers concerned with one specific commodity lack any such qualifications, with the exception of a wine master who is of the new house, which is presumably to be identified with an annex to the palace or a distinct palace department. The remaining food managers, apart from the Rab Kwakwalati of the House of the Queen, are never identified as a member of the household of a key member of the family, or of the household of a key member of the royal family, of a provincial or a temple household. Only the affiliations of the granary masters or chiefs of granaries show that they were active in Nineveh, in the city of Maganuba, and in the land of Bertu. Although we are dealing here with only a few references in total, the distribution of the known affiliations appear nevertheless to be significant, when more so if we take into account the approximate date of the reference. Hence, the majority of food managing offices is already attested in the first half of the 8th century, while individuals explicitly affiliated to the temples occur from the reign of Sargon II onwards. As of the palace points to the reign of Sargon II, a time when also the other institutional affiliations are tested for the first time. The food managers working for key members of the royal family are only known from the 7th century, when the establishment of these royals seemed to have expanded considerably. Also, the reference to the wine master of the new house stems from a legal record dating from the reign of Assurbanipal or later, based on the fact that the earliest datable attestation of a food manager qualified as of the palace points to the reign of Sargon II, a time when also the other institutional affiliations are tested for the first time. One might conclude that at the latest, in the second half of the 8th century, the kitchen managers were no longer restricted to the royal household, and their number increased further in the 7th century. However, since we lack substantial data from before the second half of the 8th century, and it is likely that large establishments such as the Assur Temple were staffed with kitchen managers already in the early Neo-Assyrian times, this observation is to be treated with caution. Still, the absence of comparable qualifications for officials concerned with one specific type of foodstuff, including grain, is significant, and it seems that these men were usually only active in the royal households, either as a single representative of their office or as one among multiple office holders, as in the case of the chiefs of granaries, who were assigned to different places from the reign of Adad Nirari III on. The wine masters of the new house from late Neo-Assyrian times is perhaps an indicator of a continuous process of specialization within the royal household due to its increase in size and complexity over the centuries. As a consequence of the food managing offices having more than one representative at a time within or in addition to the royal household, we have to reckon with a hierarchical formation of holders of the same office, headed by the main office holder of the royal household. Comparably high density of kitchen managers employed in different spheres is likely due to the fact that institutional households were equipped with facilities for the processing and preparation of food that were staffed with skilled personnel such as cooks, confectionists, and brewers. The larger these facilities were, and the more personal they deployed, the higher is the likelihood that individuals were chosen from among them to preside over their professional section. Hence, at first sight, these people might be regarded as, for instance, the chefs de cuisine, as their titles suggest. However, the reality was different. The chief cook and the chief confectioner of the royal household do not seem to have been occupied in the palace kitchen and the palace confectionery respectively, but rather they organized the foodstuff that were needed by the working cooks and confectioners. In the case of the cooks, this involved the meat of domestic animals, and in the case of the confectioner, they were occupied with fruits and spices. With the chief cook, this developed to such an extent that he was responsible for the general management of livestock, whether needed for sacrifices, consumption, or work as drought animals. The chief cook, Sa-Elu, even became oponym in the year 620, a function which was usually reserved for high state officials, but was fulfilled also by some court officials in late Neo-Assyrian times. The other types of kitchen managers do not occur in particular connection with the royal household, nor do they seem to have developed a similar degree of abstraction and complexity. They were more hands-on. As far as one can tell from the sources, the chief baker and chief brewer and the chief oil presser seem to have borne responsibility primarily from the preparation and provision of bread, beer, and oil, mainly sesame oil, rather than from the organization of the ingredients needed. Also, the discrepancy between the literal meaning chief oil presser Rab Iti and oil master Rab Samni supports the impression that the latter managed the acquisition, storage, and distribution of oil, and the chief oil presser, as head of the oil pressers, was liable for the production of the oil pressing craft and may have even worked as an oil presser himself. Likewise, the storage of grain, which was central for the chief bakers and the chief brewers' work, was the responsibility of the chief of granaries and the Rab Danabati. One would also assume a similar distribution of responsibilities between the fruit master and the spice master on the one hand, and the chief confectioner on the other hand. They all occur in the same administrative document recording allocations of tribute to court personnel. Thus, they were active at the same time. Judging by the developed state of the office of chief confectioner, he was perhaps responsible for the acquisition of fruits and spices needed by the confectioners, while the two food managers managed the same commodities for other uses, such as raw consumption or the manufacture of perfumes. Although this is highly speculative, the responsibilities of the kitchen managers and the other food managers in any case, to a certain extent, complemented each other. Comparing the range of food served at the banquet of Assurbanipal II with the types of foodstuffs the food managers were concerned with, the management of the most important component of the elite menu, including grain, meat, and wine, was undertaken by separate officials. In the following, we will take a closer look at selected food managing offices in order to gain a better understanding of the activities of the food managers in connection with the acquisition, transport, storage, and distribution of the foodstuffs for the benefit of the royal household, inevitably including also deliveries to the temple. Since the chief of granaries, the chief cook, and the wine master are all comparatively well attested among the food managers, and since each of these offices represents one of the categories of food managers established above, they are the most suitable candidates for such an examination. Rab Carmani, Chief of Granaries. The Chief of Granaries, as his title suggests, was in charge of large storage facilities for grain. This is best documented by an administrative record from the 8th century, Kalu, according to which the storehouse Nakamatu, under the responsibility of the unnamed granary master in the land of Bertu, received a total of 12,800 homers of barley rations collected from various different places. apart from Arba-il, these are mostly unknown. Hence, corn from local centers was stored in the granary of that region, administered by the granary master. The three legal records from 7th century Kalu, Fort Shalmaneser, the unnamed chief of Granaries, is concerned with the collection of the corn and straw taxes from royal Ma'utu land. This type of land, which seems to have been maintained land for the king or his household, was apparently placed at the disposal of Samas-Au Idina, respectively, who were liable to pay taxes in return for its use of usufruct. In another administrative record bearing the same archival background as the chief of Granaries, Sagal Saru is listed along with 4,000 homers of barley. In the same record also the unknown fodder master, Rab Kassite, is listed above, or Rab Kassite, with 2,000, a certain Copti with 7,000, and the unknown Rab Danibade with 1,000 homers of barley. And the city of Nineveh is recorded with 3,050 homers of barley, which were collected inter alia from Kirbi-il, Sabaneba, and Talmusa, all provincial cities located in the Assyrian heartland north of Nineveh. Since the deliveries were made to Nineveh, the grain amounts in Nineveh and in charge of the officials may have been meant for another final destination, perhaps Kalu, the place where the tablets was found, and the imperial capital at that time. In any case, this document reveals the operation of the barley supply for the urban centers of the Assyrian heartland, something that is also reflected in the administration text, were 70 homers, 7 says of grain. The total imposed upon several men listed in personal name are said to be Anna Nineveh. The chief of Granaries also supplied individual palace departments and palace members with grain, as is clear from legal text, recorded administrative procedures. When the chief of Granaries, Il Amar, owes 200 barley rations to be delivered to Dur Surakin, this reflects an official obligation rather than a personal loan. Presumably also Nasr Bel, possibly chief of Granaries, who owed 4 barley rations to a certain Manu Ki Arba in late Neo-Assyrian times, acted here in his official capacity, not least because the indebted barley is qualified as food fodder, kasutu, which in other legal records from Fort Shalmaneser marks their administrative background. Hence, in both cases, the chief of Granary was ex officio obliged to supply amounts of grain which he did not yet manage to deliver. In other cases, the chief of Granaries appears as a provider of corn for temple offerings, This can be placed in the context of general duties that were also imposed on other officials, primarily the high state officials who had appropriated resources at their disposal. According to the letter of the scholar Arkulanvanu to the king Assurbanipal, the unnamed chief of Granaries is listed among the officials, mainly provincial governors, who did not yet hand in their contributions of barley and emmer for the regular offerings gnu in the Assur temple. Hence, the chief of Granaries and his establishment had separate resources available, independent of the provincial stock of grain. Although the title Rab Carmani explicitly refers to the Karmu, this official never actually occurs in association with such an installation. Rather, the chief of Granaries is once recorded as being responsible for a storage facility called Nakamater, a term which is otherwise often used to refer to treasury or treasury houses containing precious metals or associated with horses. Thus, the Nakamatu did not serve exclusively as a storage facility for grain, as was the case with the Karmu, since one would nevertheless assume that the Rab Carmani was responsible for the establishments designated Karmu in the Neo-Assyrian sources. Another relevant reference to the Karmu, the only Neo-Assyrian attestation written with the determinative, occurs in a letter of Amr Ili, who may have been active in Arab Il. Here, Amr Ili reports to the king that the Karmu between the Betquat storehouse of the Sapan Saki palace supervisor has fallen down. This incident might or might not have taken place in the city of Arbi-Il, Amr Ili's possible place of work, but it is shown that the Karmu was an urban installation, well integrated into the cityscape and rather close to the representative buildings, i.e. the palace. The Karmu was administered by provincial authorities, the deputy governor, but had a particular connection to the king and his household, judging by its description of the king. This, together with the other evidence, indicate that the Middle Assyrian system is installing royal granaries in provincial capitals was maintained in the Neo-Assyrian period. In addition to this, however, the source of the Neo-Assyrian period also refers to a Karmu of the Nabu temple and of the house of the skilled men, Manu, while in the Middle Assyrian text, Karmu of the Assur temple and of the individuals may be attested. Hence, Karmu was also used as a generic term for the storage facility of grain, and the Rab Carmani was not responsible for all of these individual establishments, but, as noted, he took care of the granaries, whether designated Karmu or not, of the royal household, which were administered separately from the provincial ones. Apart from his general duties to provide grain for offerings in the Assur temple, He does not seem to have been concerned with the corn supply for temples. Although chronologically removed from each other, the geographical attributions of the Rab Carmani referring to provinces, provincial capitals, and other places in the Assyrian center, Nineveh, Meganuba, and north of it, Bertu, indicate that several such officials were active for the royal household at a time. There is no indication that they were hierarchically organized, but instances where the office of the Rab Carmani is listed together with the provincial governors suggest that there existed one main representative. The Rabnu Atami chief cook. As already pointed out, the chief cook of the royal household was not active as an actual cook in the palace kitchen, but rather he managed the supply of livestock for the urban centers. Apart from functioning as a representative of the department that delivered the foods, different types of meat, as far as preserved, that were served for the royal dinner. The chief cook was primarily concerned with the acquisition of the living animals. He obtained cattle and sheep inter alia via the distribution of tribute revenue by the palace and as tax payments from the provinces. Regarding the latter source of supply, the chief cook occurs in connection with Ibtu, which seems to denote a tax on domestic animals drawn from the offspring of the animals at one's disposal. This is the case in an administrative document dealing with levied oxen and sheep, occurring to which the department of the unnamed chief cook is in charge of 140 oxen meant for offerings. Also, in another administrative record, the chief cook Assurid is provisioned with 71 old or dead red Lebiru or Metu mules. Described as Ibtu, when Inerta Bel an official active in the Northwest, claims that he has no resources for taking care of and feeding the oxen of the palace that were assigned to him. These might have been the very animals that the chief cook took over after they had been properly fed as grazing livestock, or fattened as fat stock kept in stables in the provinces. For instance, a broken administrative document records in total 1,998 grain-fed sheep distributed over various different provinces and other administrative units, of which 1,522 sheep were in the charge of the unnamed shepherd of the mill or banquet, Ra'i Neptuni. Due to his interest in fed and fattened livestock, the chief cook was associated with shepherds, as is clear from the case of a chief cook who was in charge of 3 palace shepherds. The use of the livestock managed by the chief cook was manifold. Though also working animals were organized by the chief cook, his main concern seems to have been to cover the demand for livestock occasioned by culinary, cultic, and scholarly activities. In the first place, we would expect the chief cook of the main palace to have been responsible for the acquisition and delivery of domestic animals intended for the ordinary consumption of the king and his entourage. However, we not only lack concrete evidence for the daily meal of the royal household, we also lack evidence for the chief cook's involvement in this matter. By contrast, we learn of festive banquets where large amounts of meat were offered and consumed, and several administrative records are preserved which lists different types of meat and cuts of meat together with other foodstuffs in association with offerings and their subsequent consumption. Similarly, the chief cook is attested in connection with livestock meant for offering and other rituals, although the general lack of concrete evidence for daily meal is easily explained by the fact that the arrangement for it had no need to be mentioned or discussed in the royal inscriptions, the royal correspondence, and non-documentary text. One wonders why the chief cook occurs in the administrative records, especially in connection with offerings, but not with livestock meant for the daily meal. The number of references to the chief cook's tasks is limited, but in view of the central role assumed by the consumption of offerings leftovers at the king's table, the chief cook's preoccupation is reflected in the source is not a matter of accident. More so, if we take into account that the trauma caused by the killing of living creatures for the human diet had to be overcome by sacrificing activities and collective consumption in order to reestablish the cosmic order, the same author also states that although on the basis of this principle every slaughter for meat was accompanied by ritual procedures, the circulation and way of consumption of meat were certainly part of a system of distribution which had little or nothing to do with the economy of sacrificial meat in Mesopotamia. He also states that palace and temple share, in fact, the same concern of meat provisioning, but stresses that the maintenance of the gods in the temple was substantially different from the sustenance of human beings in the palace. Nevertheless, the economic process of the palace, in conjunction with its meat supply, seems to have been closely connected to the Assur temple and also other temples, especially, but not only during the cultic performances in the context of the New Year's festivities lasting from the 11th month, Sabaoth, to the first month, Nisanu, of the following year. The number of livestock slaughtered on the occasion of these festivities was unsurpassed by the amount of meat produced in the context of any other event that took place at regular intervals. According to Parpola daily deliveries of leftovers from the New Year's performances provided enough meat for about 700 individuals, while up to 3,500 to 5,000 individuals could have been maintained on peak days. Since the performance of meat offerings in the Asser temple and other temples involved the slaughtering, cutting, and preparation of meat, the sanctuaries must have been equipped with or surrounded by appropriate areas, instruments, and personnel in order to transform the living animal into a cooked dish. The Neo-Assyrian written sources indeed refer to slaughterhouses, kitchen facilities, and even establishments for the conservation of meat, salt meat house, in association with the Asser temple. A Bet Nu Atami, staffed with a butcher, Nakisu, and a salt meat man, Sa Midlishu, is known for the palace, but we lack evidence for special slaughterhouses and for separate facilities for the conservation of meat in connection with the palace. Although the slaughter and the processing of meat must have also happened in the domestic area of the palace, the supply of the royal household with meat seems to have been, to a considerable extent, organized via the Asser temple and other temples due to cultic requirements. The abundance of meat which was sacrificed in the Asser temple, especially during the New Year's festivities, produced such a surplus that the meat had to be conserved or passed on to other institutions. This is clear from a letter of Dadi, who has been told by the temple scribe to forward to the Sakintu of the inner city equal Asser leftovers of meat offerings that had previously been given to the salt meat house. Hence, regarding the consumption of meat, we can observe a reciprocal relationship between palace and temple, the latter being central for the meat supply for the royal household that was supervised by the chief cook. Rab Karani, wine master. On analogy with the other food managers, the wine master must have been concerned with the acquisition, storage, and distribution of wine. Administrative records dealing with the palace income of wine are rare and for the most part not conclusive, though there is, for instance, a record from the Northwest Palace in Kalu about the deliveries of livestock and wine from various unknown cities. Another document from Fort Shalmaneser lists the income of audience gifts in the form of wine. Also, in the letter of Babaleu Bal Equisi and another man named Lost to the king Assurbanipal, a storage place for the wine that came in as audience gift in the 10th month, Kanunu, is requested. None of these texts mentions the wine master, but it seems fair to suppose that this official actually supervised incoming wine and its subsequent storage. Also, although the list of wine allocations from Fort Shalmaneser did not give any clue as to the department or official managing and distribution of wine among the court society, the wine master is the most plausible candidate in this respect, not least because he occurs as a recipient of comparatively large amounts of wine in several of these lists. The records stem on the one hand from room SW6, which contains large storage jars up to 300 liters capacity, and was located next to the room where a considerable part of the dossier of the palace manager Rab Ekali was found, and on the other from the room NE 48 and 49 close to the northern eastern palace entrance. It is likely that the wine master operated here in line with the duties of the chief of Granaries and the chief cook. The wine master of the palace regularly had to provide amounts of wine for offering activities in the temples, as is clear from royal decrees and schedules. When the astrologer Akulanu reports to the king Esarhaddon or Assurbanipal that the unnamed wine master, together with his deputy and his scribe in the 7th month, Tasritu, did not refill wine to be offered in the Ashur temple. This refers directly to such regulations laid down by the king. I therefore suggest that the wine master in question was appointed to the royal household rather than the Ashur temple. Also, the sum of 9 minas 15 shekels of silver meant for the regular offerings Genu of Assur and owed by Zaruti, wine master of the new house, and his deputy Ululeu, presumably had a similar background. As with the chief cook, most of the direct evidence we have regarding the tasks of the wine master refer to the supply of wine for offerings. Although we know that also consecrated wine, the leftovers of offerings in the temples, was consumed in the palace, it is clear that this cannot have been the only source. Leaving aside the possible loss of text written on perishable material and other such difficulties relating to the uneven distribution of sources, the lack of information is presumably because there was usually no need to communicate about the internal distribution of wine in writing. Moreover, the documentation of administrative procedures in the Neo-Assyrian period was generally less extensive. Together with the chief cook, the wine master took care of most valuable foodstuffs consumed by the gods and the Assyrian elite, items that were not usually available for the ordinary people. In contrast to the chief cook, the wine master was responsible for a finished product delivered to the urban centers, and like his colleagues from the same category, he did not preside over a professional group. The main representative of this office likely had his bureau in the imperial capital, in contrast to the managers of grain who took care of silos beyond the palace walls, and even beyond the walls of the imperial capital. As with the Neo-Assyrian sources, several different types of kitchen managers are attested in the Middle Assyrian textual material, including the chief cook, Rab Nu Atem Mi, the chief confectioner, Rab Kirkandini, the chief baker, Rab Allah Inni, the chief brewer, Rab Saras, and the chief oil presser, Rab Iti, assumed that they presided over rather small groups of individuals, maybe comprising of about 10 people. Hence, several chief cooks or chief confectioners may have been active at the same time. In any case, it was already in the Middle Assyrian period that the office of chief cook in particular developed into a more complex role, since one of its holders was eponym in the reign of Assur-nadin Apli, early 12th century, as was the chief cook Sa-ilu in the Neo-Assyrian period. The occurrence of the title of chief cook in a fragmentary inscription on an Assur stele, perhaps accompanied by a reference to the chief confectioner, underlines this impression and suggests that also the office of the chief confectioner could be represented by a prominent figure at that time. Unfortunately, we lack concrete evidence for the tasks of the Middle Assyrian chief cook, but it is likely that the responsibilities of the chief cook of the royal household were similar to what we learned from the Neo-Assyrian evidence. Support for this suggestion comes from the archives of the Offerings House in Assur, headed by the Rab Gena-e, Offerings Overseer. According to its written remnants, this department administered cereals, sesame, syrup or honey, and fruits provided by the province for the regular offerings in the Assur temple. Who dealt with this archive recently point out the lack of domestic animals or meat, which formed already in Middle Assyrian times an integral component of provincial provisions for offerings in the Assur temple. According to Gaspa, this may have been simply owed to the different way of record keeping, but Postgate goes to step further and suggests a different system for supplying the Assur temple with meat, given that there already existed an office of Rab Nu Atami of apparently enhanced status. I suggest that already in the Middle Assyrian period of Atami period, the chief cook was responsible for the management of meat needed for the divine meal, and as a consequence, the king's meal. There is evidence for a rather regular provision of bread, beer, and oil by the Offerings House for the palace, which also involved leftovers from offerings. But it is clearly support and that the palace had other resources for the supply of these commodities. Also, the supply of meat for the palace and temple may have been maintained by more than one department, as indicated by another archive found in Assur between the Anu Adad temple and the old palace. The owner of the archive was the Fatner Muta, also bearing the titles Sa Resi and Zuraku, who took care of the livestock which was brought as audience gifts, Nemertu, to the palace. These gifts were delivered by provincial governors, local stewards, or treasurers, etc., for the benefit of the prince Inerta Takalti Asur in the reign of Assur-Dan I. The incoming cattle were meant for the mills of Inerta Takalti Asur, for the feeding of the lions kept by the palace, for exorcists and the performance of sacrifice, and for the expenditure of personal gifts, Remutu. Hence, the wide range of uses of cattle administered by a single department may remind us of the Neo-Assyrian period. Apart from the majority of the text representing a unilateral documentation for internal usage, there is a sealed account of cattle received and issued over half a year, ratified by a certain Pu'ah, according to the other references to this man within Muta's archive and elsewhere, whose title is unknown, concluded that he was closely associated with Muta and perhaps his immediate superior, assuming that the office of chief cook had overall responsibilities for the meat supply. Pu'ah seems to be a suitable candidate for this position, who, in his official capacity, supervised departments at a lower administrative level. As to managers concerned with distinct types of foodstuff, we do not find the same titles that are known for the Neo-Assyrian period. Instead, singular references to a Samu-e Samni and a Samu-e Karani, the titles Rab Samni and Rab Karani respectively, assuming that the Samu-e Samni and the Samu-e Karani likewise managed the supply of oil and wine for the palace. The administration of these commodities on behalf of the palace was managed by separate departments, as was the case in the first millennium BCE. When we look for administrators of grain and grain storage facilities in the Middle Assyrian sources, however, there are no references to offices such as the Rab Carmani and Cab Dinabati. I am also not aware of attestations of any equivalent term or other official designation that might suggest a similar occupation. However, as we have seen, royal grain storage facilities called Karmu were distributed over the urban centers in the Middle Assyrian period, and these needed to be managed. For the royal Kamu in Assur refers to two families with close ties to the king and his household, which seem to have been responsible for it and ran the royal Karmu as a family business. It is also a question of designation and whether the administration of the Karmus bore the title Rab Carmani or Rab Karmai. or another similar title does not change the fact that they had the same function. We can nevertheless observe one significant difference compared with the circumstances in the Neo-Assyrian period. We do not have evidence for the Rab Carmani or his food-managing colleagues active in the royal household, exercising their office within an elite family network where the son typically follows his father in office. Admittedly, this is primarily a matter of sources, and while several Middle Assyrian administrative archives were unearthed in Assur, we lack comparable material from the succeeding period. However, there is reason to assume that in Neo-Assyrian times, the king preferred to appoint independent and professionally skilled men to these offices. This possible change in the bureaucratic ethos also involved the more frequent appointment of Resis to state offices as Ram among the Neo-Assyrian food managers. Only Anurta Ea succeed, a chief of the cooks, and the herdsman is designated Sa-Rezi of Adad Nirari III on his cylinder sill. In the standard formula of his grants of tax exemption, Assurbanipal describes himself as the one who always behaves kindly towards the Sa-Resis who serve him. Sa'ana lu su et seg mes man za azpa ni su ita na ba lu ina dam qua ati. Although the beneficiaries themselves, including the Rab Sa-Rezi, the chamberlain, and the fodder master, are not directly referred to as Sa-Rezi, it is likely that they were addressed with this introductory statement. Though this remains unproven, it could indicate that middle-ranking palace offices, such as that of the fodder master, but also of the granary master and other food managing offices, were held by the same class of men, namely Sa-Resis. Whether or not this means eunuch, or rather courtier, is such a standardized document. Assurbanipal's use of the term Sa-Rezi in this context indicates a systematic or unified treatment of his officials, according to the Middle Assyrian sources. Especially the common palace personnel and the Quipu agents of the king were designated Sa-Rezi. By contrast, the highest state offices were maintained by the elite families and their houses over generations, and their office holders, the magnates, Rabbi Anu, were possibly distinguished from the Saranu. Cases such as the provincial governor and treasurer, Namkur Sari, who is attested with the title Sa-Rezi, seem to have been rather exceptional. Like state offices were preferably staffed with eunuchs, In Neo-Assyrian times, the same change in policy may have affected the lower level of administration, including the food management. However, we should not expect an abrupt and overall change, but rather a steady development with fluctuations towards a professionalization of the different administrative levels. Although we catch a glimpse of this policy already in the Middle Assyrian period, this was developed much further in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The latter administration is also characterized by the illustration of deputies, Saniu, beneath state officials and court officials, including the food managing offices, a custom which is rarely known from the Middle Assyrian period and that can also be taken as a sign of increasing professionalization. While at a first sight one expects significant differences in the way food was managed for the royal household in the two periods, the basic administrative structures and distribution of responsibilities, meat, grain, wine, etc., also exists in the Middle Assyrian period, as did the strong reciprocal relationship between palace and temple. Based on these foundations, the food management apparatus, along with the entire Neo-Assyrian administration, developed further into a more complex and also a more rational system. The subject of fugitives often occurs in the narratives of the Assyrian military campaigns. The annals teem with biased descriptions of escaping hostile rulers or of entire communities overwhelmed by the radiant glory of god Ashur. Contrary to the royal inscriptions, which repeatedly present us with the same scheme, a true cliché, the texts from the state archives touch on the problem from quite a different micro-historical perspective. More than 100 letters contain information about fugitives. This material is presented in the appendix and analysis in this article from several perspectives. The letters related to fugitives allow to some extent a deeper insight into numerous issues such as the geographical distribution of runaways, the causes of their fleeing, and the social background of fugitives. Above all, however, we are presented with a variety of real individuals operating in a real environment. The documents also reveal a certain modus operandi of the state when attempting to prevent this social negative phenomenon. Unfortunately, one of the main drawbacks of such research is the scarcity of the material at our disposal. The text corpus consists of only letters spanning from Tiglath-Pileser III to Ashurbanipal, and a significant number are fragmentary or lack any contextual information. Frequently, there is only a small piece of information about a single event without a more detailed context. In many cases, it is impossible to answer the most simple questions such as who was the fugitive, where did he come from, where he was fleeing to, and where he could effectively go, as well as which basic motivations made him run away, and whether he succeeded in his risky enterprise. Furthermore, the geographical distinction of the source material is largely uneven, making it difficult or even impossible to follow any changes in the given area in a certain period of time. Finally, the letters do not contain any information about the legal procedures concerning the captured fugitives and their accomplices. It is therefore impossible to reconstruct a coherent justice system, possibly socially universal, directly involved in prosecuting, sentencing, and finally punishing the captured. We are not able to follow all these stages, nor can we clearly define the responsibilities of individual officials of the Assyrian administration. Studying the letters, however, one is struck by the flexible approach the Assyrian state to some runaways. So far, the role of fugitive in the Neo-Assyrian correspondence has not been subject to a thorough analysis in the broader context of the whole empire. Few works, however, refer to this issue. Giovanni B. Lanfranchi outlines some aspects of the problem by taking notice of several dozen of letters dealing with runaways dated to the realm of Sargon II, while Simo Parpola analyzed the legal status of deserters and fugitives in the interstate treaties concluded between the Assyrian Empire and its vassal and allied states. An important work of Daniel C. Snell deals with the flights of slaves and with the concept of freedom in the ancient Near East from the beginning of the Mesopotamian civilization to the Neo-Babylonian period. Although Snell does not deal with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a full chapter of his work is dedicated to the Middle Assyrian laws and to 3 later texts from the first millennium BCE, which describe the brutal punishments inflicted upon the captured fugitives. The key word which denotes the verb to escape in the letters is the Akkadian verb alaku, Neo-Babylonian eleku. According to the AHW, the Grandstrom of this verb means verschwinden, zugredingehen, fliehen, the Doppelstam, zam, verschwinden, bringen, and stam, entkommen, lassen. According to the CAD, the verb alaku means to disappear, to vanish, to become missing or lost, to perish, to escape, to flee, to make disappear, let escape, to help escape, to cause losses. The verbal objective is alku, translated in CAD, escaped, missing, lost. Also, the verb makatu refers to runaways. If its basic meaning is to fall down, to collapse, in the Neo-Assyrian letters, its verbal adjective, maktu, sometimes denotes a deserter, a fugitive, specifically from the army. Finally, the verb abatu, to capture, and its verbal adjective abtu means may indicate that the letter deals with fugitives who are often called pariu, criminal. The paucity of the text, in many cases their fragmentary state of preservation, and a general dearth of the contextual information prevent from drawing far-reaching conclusions and generalizations about the geographical distribution of the escapes. Nevertheless, the letters reveal that the problem of fugitives affected the whole empire. People fled from one province to another or within the same province, while others took refuge in foreign countries. The fact, however, that one of the provincial governors writes more frequently to the king about runaways than his counterpart in another region of the empire is probably just a coincidence, since it might be the result of a disappropriate distribution of the sources. Such a situation inevitably leads to a blurred and deceptive perspective, which in turn hampers any effect of a more or less credible reconstruction of the past, let alone of grasping the chances both synchronically and diachronically. Along the northern frontier of the empire, the buffer state of Serbia, sandwiched between Assyria and Urartu, tops the list as a safe haven for fugitives. Its rulers willingly granted asylum, which may have been motivated by religious reasons. Its location and topography also made it an easier shelter for refugees to run away to. Another important factor contributed to a larger number of runaways is the chapter of the border itself, or is the character of the border itself. As Bradley J. Parker has pointed out, the northern frontier of Assyria did not form a stark line between the district political entities, but was instead a porous transitional zone that separated the northern provinces of the Assyrian Empire from the autonomous cultures of southeastern Anatolia. Furthermore, two other areas stand out as places of refuge: the eastern Assyrian provinces of Babylonia. In several letters, fugitives from both regions are mentioned. These letters are a product of a political expansion of the empire, which is in turn reflected in a larger number of sources. In the eastern provinces, a new political environment characterized by a myriad of small entities and by a difficult terrain may have contributed to an increase in the number of runaways. As for Babylonia, its multi-ethnic population and the frequently changing geopolitical situation seems to have been the main factor. Looking at runaways from a micro-historical perspective, fugitives could preferably select two different areas for their inaccessibilities: mountainous regions and marshlands, which were excellent hideouts where they could feel relatively safe and secure. Unfortunately, there are only a few examples. Highlanders from the town of Lapsia opposed the orders of Taklak Ana Bel, governor of Naabini. The whole community escaped onto the nearby mountain so that the majordomo sent by the governor could only find the deserted town. This story resembles the narrative of the military campaign of the Assyrian kings, where local people are told to have found shelter in inaccessible mountainous regions. They abandoned their towns and villages to save their lives. Babylonian marshlands also offered a safe refuge for fugitives, as in Bit Mukani during the reign of Assur-Haddon and Assur-Banipal. According to Nabu Asalim from Bit Dakuri, that inhospitable area was a safe sanctuary for 30 families who had escaped during the time of Samas Ibni. They enjoyed such impunity as to refuse to work for the king, and even worse, to conspire several times with the enemy. We do not know if they were captured and resettled. Further, the southern Babylonian marshlands served as a very good hideout for Merodach Baladan when he was pursued by Sennacherib. In this instance, the Assyrian king admits a failure, saying, "I hastened after him, Merodach Baladan, to the land of Gazamanu, and ordered my warriors into the midst of swamps and marshes. For 5 days they sought him out, but his hiding place could not be found." Fugitives belonged to all social classes of the empire. The relevant documents concern servants, deportees, and workers, as well as soldiers and low and high-ranking officials, although the runaways of the latter group are known only from Assur-Haddon's letters to the god Assur. The letters reveal a variety of reasons underlying their decision to flee. 4 broad categories of fugitives can be determined: criminals like thieves, robbers, and smugglers, as well as more dangerous criminals accused of the most serious crimes, including murder. Within this group, there are also the lowest ranking officials. Nabu Sumu Edina, an inspector of the Nabu temple in Kalu, sent the king a detailed list of 10 village managers, Rab Alani, quoting their names and places of origin, who, instead of coming for the review, had run away. Unfortunately, the end of the letter, which might explain the exact reason for their escape, is broken away. Since, however, according to the letters, the primary responsibility of the village managers was to collect taxes, it is reasonable to assume that the fugitives simply committed some sort of fraud. From this letter, it is clear that the administration might commit negligence, fraud, or even insubordination. Overexploited people, such as those who fled because of their bad living conditions and or unbearable obligations to the state. 2 letters from the reign of Sargon II will show the burdens of life of the subjugated people of the expanding empire. The first concerns the situation after the conquest of Carchemish, when the inhabitants of the city start to complain about too heavy illicu duties. According to an official reporting to the king, they notoriously crossed the Euphrates and settled in the province of Arpad. It is not known whether the local authorities successfully tackled the problem. Nabu Ramani, the governor of Parsua, explains to Sargon why, after being settled in Parsua, deportees from Tabal, who had come in a caravan from Karsarukan, ran away to Mania. In Parsua they were received that in Parsu they were to receive all necessary means of support, but a large-scale embezzlement by a Sa-Korbuti forced them to flee to Mania. Having learnt about the whole situation, Nabu Ramani succeeded in capturing some of them and provided the deportees with a livelihood. Additionally, the letter deserves particular attention because the governor feels obligated to excuse himself for his negligence. He was in media at the time and did not know about the embezzlement and the escapes. Undoubtedly, he was afraid of being blamed for indolence, which could consequently result in his dismissal by the king. This letter attests to a specific approach to the fugitive who ran away because of economic reasons. We can suppose that there was some understanding for those people and the reason why they fled. The authorities aimed to prevent the situation occurring again and therefore provided securely their basic needs instead of meting out punishments. Deserters are well documented in the sources. It should be noted that the underlying reason for desertion are often similar to those of civilians, so that they may be included in the groups mentioned. As it happens everywhere and regardless of time, soldiers of the Assyrian army committed the same criminal offenses as civilians. For example, the already mentioned well-known case of the murder of the mayor of Materna. The burden of military service or shortages of food supply may too have contributed to desertion, but these are only conjectures as the sources do not convey directly any such reasons for it. Two factors probably made desertion easier. First, the fact that some troops served in the provinces along the border of the empire with the enemy countries, which were well disposed towards deserters. Second, cavalry units were very mobile and they were able to run away quickly and to cover long distances before the discovery of their desertion. Fugitives of Assyria, like runaways from other countries, were people of different social backgrounds. Some were specialists in a given trade and therefore could hope to obtain relatively good living conditions. A shortage of craftsmen needed for the hope to obtain relatively good the shortage of craftsmen needed for the huge building enterprises of the Assyrian kings created a favorable environment for a highly qualified labor force. Several letters refer to desertions of enemy soldiers. Desertions could result from the military situation when the balance was tipping in favor of Assyria. Two letters from the time of Tiglath-Pileser III concern the desertions from Damascus just before the annexation of the city in 732 BCE. The former pertains to a commander of 50, Rab-Ans, who fled to Assyria, while the latter reports on mercenaries who changed sides. In all likelihood, they were later incorporated into the Assyrian army as members of the auxiliary units. Some cavalry deserters also brought their mounts for the Assyrian army. In a letter of Samas Takalak to Sargon, it is stated that the prefect of the recruitment officers, Saknasunu Sa Masurkinsani, was not only responsible for recruiting of soldiers and horses, but he also dealt with the matters concerning deserters. Interestingly, if the enemy soldier hesitated to desert, the Assyrians encouraged him to change side. One way to do it was to dispatch a special messenger with a token, iterate, which signaled the readiness of the Assyrian Empire to accept them. Thus, it seems that not only did Assyrians give shelter to fugitives, but they also actively tried to acquire them. It is obvious that an increasing number of runaways from a given country revealed that the internal political situation in that country was deteriorating. How useful such pieces of information were for the Assyrian kings, and how they could influence his decision for waging war, is attested. In this letter, Bel-Usazib, a Babylonian astrologer from the inner circle of scholars, advises Assur-Haddon on the impending Assyrian invasion of the Manian territory. Apart from his astrological observations, Bel-Usazib notices that deserters outnumbered fighting men among the enemy. Therein lies your advantage. At the entry of the whole army, let patrols make sorties, capture their men in the open country, and question them. If the Indarians are keeping away from them, the army can invade and throw itself against the cities. Both fugitive soldiers and representatives of the foreign administration were invaluable informers for Assyrians. It seems that the Assyrians followed specific procedures concerning deserters. Sent to the king from the Manian frontier, a message by Assur-Usalim describes the steps taken by the Assyrians stationed in the forts along the border in regard to the fugitives coming there from Media, and Abuskia. According to the king's instructions, each new fugitive should be handed over to a messenger of Assur-Usalim, who would bring him to the crown prince. If the fugitive had some important information, it is Assur-Usalim's duty to make a detailed report and to deliver the sealed letter immediately to the king by the cohort commander of the crown prince. Such reports undoubtedly contain intelligence data about the movements of an enemy army or the political situation of a hostile country, and even about some economic matters. Referring to a certain fugitive from Gubla named Barul, who reports to Assur-Ila'i a military official of Tiglath-Pileser III, on the Prince of Barley in the town of Uri. The most wanted runaways were, of course, the members of the foreign elite, courtiers who were in attendance of a ruler. Since the court was the center of government, they possessed invaluable knowledge about sensitive state secrets. In addition, they could be used as bargaining cards in the political game. Nevertheless, letters do not usually refer to defections of the higher-ranking officials and members of royal families. Only one letter concerns the Arartian governor who fled to Assyria during the apogee of the Assyria-Arartian conflict. It is quite exceptional because the defector was rewarded with one of the highest positions in the Assyrian army, and Sargon promptly appointed him as a Turtanu. The relevant material rarely informs us about the number of fugitives. When people decide to flee, they most often run away individually or in small groups numbering few persons. This is understandable since the escape of one or up to 5 people may initially have gone unnoticed. In that way, the fugitives bought time, and this maximized their chances of succeeding in fleeing and avoiding recapture. There are, of course, exceptions. Assur-Belu-da-in reports to Sargon that several hundred people escaped from the province of Alzi al-Tabi at Bari to enter Alia, Sumu, and Bit Zamini, where 300 of them were captured. Another mentions 600 fugitives who probably escaped from an enemy country to Assyria. It seems that such high numbers represent the total number of all fugitives of more than one escape within a longer period of time, rather than one mass escape. Although this is not verifiable, most individual fugitives were men. However, some letters report that entire families or communities ran away, which indicates that women and children must have participated. Only 2 letters in the whole corpus deal with flights of lonely women, dated to the reign of Assur-Haddon, a report from Bel-Le'i, a Babylonian exorcist, astrologer, and a member of the famous Ajibi family, deals with an unsuccessful flight of a slave woman of the king to Babylonia. The pursuit and capture of runaways was not an easy task. Above all, fugitives had nothing to lose, and if cornered, they may have been aggressive and dangerous. Among the fugitives there were deserters and criminals, some of whom were likely to be armed. Furthermore, we can assume that in many cases fleeing was a premeditated action in which other people were likely to have been involved. Any intrusion beyond the borders of the empire was a challenge for the pursuers, who were faced with a new and alien environment. They had to consider that they themselves were intruders, and as such they could be exposed to hostilities from indigenous people, and they did not necessarily know the terrain and the rights of way or the local customs and languages. Although several documents report on capturing fugitives, only few letters help in reconstructing the makeup and the modus operandi of the pursuing group. The relevant documents pertain exclusively to the activities along the northern frontiers of the empire, particularly in Serbria. A fragmentary preserved letter reports on a cavalry detachment, but from its context it is difficult to conclude whether the cavalrymen deserted or simply were missing in action somewhere near the Urartian border. Since the letter further mentions the land of Abuskia, it seems that the search may have been conducted somewhere in the northeast or east of the Assyrian Triangle. As soon as their flight was discovered, a hunt for the runaways was launched. Mobility was the key to success for the pursuers and the fugitives alike, especially in the regions along the border. As it has already been pointed out, a fugitive from the Assyrian-controlled Upper Tigris region to Serbia or further north to Urartu could successfully reach the Serbian capitals Upumu and Kilimari in 1 day's march. The pursuing group was made up of soldiers commanded by officers whose task was to arrest the fugitives, owing to the fact that the kings of Subria willingly granted asylum to runaways regardless of their social status and criminal record. The soldiers were accompanied by officials. It seems possible that their task was to conduct negotiations with the Subrian authorities in order to make them hand back the fugitives. Trackers, Radiu Kibsu, were likely to be involved in searching for runaways. The trackers were expected to guide the Assyrian officials on their tracks of the Subrian territory and to follow the runaways. In another case, the person involved in a large-scale search for runaways was a mule stable attendant. Some letters revealed the procedures that were taken to discover the whereabouts of missing persons. First of all, the fugitive had to be identified if the officials did not know whether he was hiding within Assyria or whether he had fled to another country. They had no other option but to search and gather additional information. Asur-Patinu, a royal official active in Bit Zamani, reports to Sargon about a certain Ilika, a mule stable attendant whose servants left him and ran away. The official diligently prepared a detailed list of the fugitives, which included their names and the towns from which they came. This kind of information may have been used to compile registers, in some ways similar to modern police databases, of the fugitives from different provinces, as in the case of the list from the provinces of Simu, Taklak Ana Bel, governor of Naabina, is involved in the search of a person whose detention is demanded by the king himself. After futile attempts to capture the hiding man in the town of Bar al-Zah, the authorities concentrated their efforts in his homeland, and his hometown, Mutiani, was scoured. His brother living there was captured and interrogated. The Assyrian officials hoped that the fugitive would sooner or later return there, or at least would contact his relatives. Kina, a clergyman named Laguda, expresses his belief to a colleague that a certain Azael, a wanted Babylonian, will return to his family, and assures him that if he returns, I shall arrest him and give him to my brother. What is interesting here is the fact that Kina was offered a reward. If you catch him, I will give you the equivalents of a horse, or a donkey, or a sheep. Undoubtedly, rewards encouraged the officials to intensify search operations. We can also presume that there were rewards for those who captured fugitives, as it is known from the Code of Hammurabi. The same way of gathering information about the fugitive by capturing and interrogating his family members and kinspeople. An unknown author reports to Tiglath-Pileser on an escape of Tadi-Il, an emissary of Mukan-Ziri, to his superior. The author sends a message to Adad Aplu Adina to capture Iadi-Il's people, who are in his homeland in Idani. They are to be interrogation, or probably to be kept as hostages. According to Marduk from Barsippa, who reports to have arrested Nabu Zeru Idina, a citizen of Barsippa, no one who sins against the Lord of Kings escapes, while Esarhaddon boasts that neither he who made the sea has fortress, nor he who made the mountain has stronghold, escaped my net, or succeeded in escaping. Such statements seem not always to be rooted in evidence and reality, but were more a wishful thinking of the Assyrian kings. An escape of a high-ranking official or a disloyal vassal may have been regarded as a sin, an act of treason, and those who fled to a hostile country committed a grave crime against the gods. Such offenses against the state could not be forgiven or go unpunished, especially if one bears in mind that the Assyrian king was responsible for maintaining order within the land of Ashur. Some letters reveal that the captured were passed on to the king, who was likely to mete out a fit and proper punishment. It seems that the king was involved only in the cases concerning the fugitives of higher social status. On the other hand, the correspondence between the ruler and the provincial administration deals with such a great diversity of cases, sometimes quite trivial, that we can presume that the king may have been kept informed by his subordinates in detail about the runaways. Let us now have a closer look at the legal procedures against the captured runaways. The letters do not contain any information about the penalty system. Not a single letter reports how the captured runaways were treated. We can only speculate what types of punishments the ruler could use against them, since no Neo-Assyrian law code has been preserved. Therefore, the only way is to cautiously assume that the treatment of fugitives in the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not differ much from the earlier periods in Mesopotamian history. Such an approach, however, is risky due to some unsolved basic problems. First, the older codes reflect an incomparable different socio-political environment. Secondly, they deal only with fugitives who were slaves and whose legal status was quite different from the members of other social strata. Further, as Snell has pointed out, the previous legislators primarily concentrate on punishing those who lent a helping hand to slave fugitives. The Code of Hammurabi in circa 1750 BCE contains the severest penalties for the accomplices. He who helped a runaway slave to escape is punished by death. Also, he who later gave him shelter was punished with death. Paragraph 19 is different. A possible criminal liability rests on those who captured the runaways but due to negligence allowed them to escape again. Other earlier codes are more lenient in punishing the accomplices, assisting the illegally holding runaways. According to the Code of Lipit Ishtar, circa 1870 BCE, he who hid fugitives was obliged to give a slave for a slave or to pay a high compensation to the owner of the slave, while in the laws of Ishnuna, circa 1930 BCE, he who detained a fugitive for a period of time longer than 1 month and did not return him or her to the owners was charged with theft. The Middle Assyrian laws before 1070 BCE dealt with wives who ran away from their husbands. The harborer was punished financially, but what is more, if his wife helped the fugitive woman, both could face mutilation by cutting off their ears. Since we do not have any Neo-Assyrian code, we are left with no other option but to attempt to interpret what can be gleaned from the surviving relevant letters. An ambiguous picture emerges of what legal procedures the Assyrian administration enforced upon the captured runaways and their accomplices. 2 letters shed some light on accomplice liability. A report on a village manager who assisted the escape to Apumu in Subria of 2 servants, presumably slaves, who belonged to Nabukinu governor of Tili. The village manager was arrested and was to be punished. but the letter does not specify what kind of punishment was to be administered. Similarly, a certain Bala-u Ikei, who gave shelter to runaway slaves, was required to hand them over to his son, a possible owner, immediately, and to stand trial before the king himself. The letter says nothing about the punishment to Balu-u Ikbi. Also, in this case, another unresolved question is whether he who hosted the runaways acted without having any idea of whom he sheltered in his house, or whether he actively participated in the execution of the crime. The involvement of the king in the case of Bala-u Ikbi, however, may attest to the importance attached to such criminal acts of assisting those who committed such sins. As for the runaway slaves, it seems that those who were captured were treated with utmost brutality. Such a conclusion can be drawn not only from the corpus under study, but also from Esarhaddon's letters to the god Asur. As for all of the runaway fugitives who had abandoned their owners and fled to the land Subria, I cut off their hands and removed their noses, eyes, and ears. We can only speculate whether the punishment meted out to the runaway slaves in Subria was an explanatory way of handling the captured runaways according to Assyrian law. Esarhaddon's brutality may be explicable by his desire to teach the Subrian king Iktesib a lesson and to solve the problem of him protecting fugitives once and for all, particularly when after the murder of Sennacherib, Subria also became a safe haven for political opponents of Esarhaddon. The letters do not always explicitly assign the fugitive to any specific social or juridical category, but it seems probable that status and other factors affected how the Assyrian administration treated the captured runaways. Some letters imply that the main goal of the administration was not only to prevent future escapes by punishment, but also to make as much use as possible of the captured runaways as a source of labor. Bel-Likbi, the governor of Upat, reports to Sargon on different matters relating to the area of Upat and Uzaza. He also complains that his carpenters who ran away, the king needs them back in Der Sarukin, obviously to work on his new capital. The governor captured them, but one of the carpenters died and the other ran away again. What can we decide from this evidence? First, the leniency on the part of the state is strictly. No punishment seems to have been meted out, at least not such as to prevent another escape. Second, these men are not simply ordinary workers, but skilled carpenters who, despite committing a crime, are strongly needed just because of their ability. We can only speculate whether the carpenters deliberately risked their lives and status as they were unique and in demand within the state. If so, they must have known from their personal experience or of their colleagues that even if captured, the governor would turn a blind eye to the crime. It is understandable that Assyrian administration took preventative measures to stop, or at least to reduce, the number of escapes. Slaves bore identification marks, which made it easier to identify and to capture them. Marduk Sapik Zeri, a Babylonian, recommended a group of scholars to Assur-Haddon, among whom there was a gifted exorcist named Akur-Aiah, who was a refugee from Assyria and a slave. Since he had marks on his face with wrists, but there is no evidence that fugitives from other social strata were branded like this or in other ways. To prevent deportees from fleeing while transporting them from one place to another, their number had to be controlled. When someone was missing, or if there was some discrepancy in the documentation, the king was immediately notified. A royal bodyguard, Suqurbuti, was dispatched back to the starting point with the task of verifying the number, and if needed, and if possible, of bringing the missing people back. We can cautiously assume that there were some independent inspections which aimed at checking the number of missing people against the one previously reported. Another way of preventing people from escaping to another country where the international treaties stipulated by the Assyrian kings Some of them have been preserved, others are known from secondary sources. The oldest treaty dealing with fugitives was concluded between Samsu-Adad V and his Babylonian counterpart Marduk Zakur-Sumi. The clause reads, "The king shall indicate to him the fugitives who fled from Assyria to Babylonia." Hence, we can conclude that the Assyrian king was to prepare a list of any fugitives who were to be deported back to Assyria from Babylonia. The treaty, or rather loyalty oath, which Assur-Narari V drew up with Mati-Ilu, king of Arpad, is the only known interstate agreement from the 8th century which pertains to runaways. In this document we read, "You shall not conceal or protect any chariot fighters or cavalrymen, nor send him to another country." As it can be seen, the clause does not concern ordinary fugitives, but potential deserters from the elite of the Assyrian army. In conclusion of such a clause into the treaty may indicate that desertion might have been a problem at the time of general political turmoil during the reign of Assur-Narari V. On the international arena, the real concern of Assyrians was the possible alliance between Arpad and the Urartian kingdom, which was attempting to expand into northern Syria. Therefore, it seems reasonable to assume that the demand of not sending the fugitive charioteers and cavalrymen to another country meant that Nerari V wanted to block the desertions to Urartu. Esarhaddon's letter to the god Asur describes the conquest of Subria, points to the existence of a treaty between Assyria and Urartu. Here Esarhaddon narrates how he dealt with the captured Urartian runaways. Contrary to the brutal treatment of the fugitives from Assyria, the king was lenient towards the Urartu, or the Urartians. According to the settlement with Rusa II, it was the Urartian king who was to mete out punishment for them. As Esarhaddon himself states, in order to keep the treaty and because of the truth and justice the great gods gave me, I inquired, questioned, investigated, and denounced those people. I did not hold back a single Urartian fugitive, and not one escaped. I returned them to their land. There is no doubt that the campaign against Subria was primarily aimed at destroying political opposition against Esarhaddon and his sons. Any successful action taken by the Assyrian king in Subria depended on the Urartian cooperation, because the conspirators could easily flee to Urartu, where we can assume that Rusa's task was to block access to his own country, although there are no clues about his real role in this alliance. It should be borne in mind that Rusa may still have hosted Esarhaddon's brothers at his court. The letter from Samas Sumu Akin to an Assyrian called Salmu Beli Lasmi harks back to a treaty which has not been preserved between Esarhaddon and Urtak of Elam. After a period of hostilities, Urtak's reign is characterized by a thaw in Elamite relations with Assyria. In 673 BCE, Elamite and Gutian messengers came to Nineveh offering peace and friendship. In this letter, Samas Sumu Ukin admonishes Salmu Beli Lasmi to obey the treaty by sending him fugitives. Among them was a former Elamite refugee, Ayar, and his family. His fate may be indicative of how a changing political situation affected the status of fugitives who could never feel safe and secure. Esarhaddon's Adi, the so-called succession treaty, was a sworn oath of loyalty in favor of the ruling dynasty aimed at preventing a rebellion against the successors of the king. As such, it imposed certain obligations on those who might have uncovered the plot. The recipients of the Adi was, among others, obliged to seize the fugitive conspirator, and if captured himself by the opponents of Assurbanipal, he was supposed to try to escape and inform him about the forthcoming threat. The paragraphs related to fugitives show that Esarhaddon wanted to avoid the escape of political opponents beyond the borders, an act which had happened after the murder of his father. These treaties were in force throughout different periods of the existence of the Assyrian Empire. They were stipulated between Assyria and its vassal states, as well as with independent political entities. When the empire was at war, it willingly welcomed fugitives from hostile countries. Some fugitives found safe haven beyond Assyria, but others had to live on the verge of society within its borders, under constant threat of being recognized, captured, and punished. Those hiding were faced with the dilemma of how to avoid being detained and, at the same time, how to secure their livelihood. We know short of nothing about their fate, the strategies they applied to survive, and the way they operated in a new social environment, nor about their relations with their families and kinsmen. Runaways became gang members who perpetrated violence against innocent people. They robbed and victimized local communities within the empire. Written by an unknown author, we learn the name of 6 criminals terrorizing the town of Nas-ur-Bel. Samas Belu-ur, the governor of Arzuina, reports to Sargon on a marauding gang in the mountainous area close to the province of Mazamua, where, near the pass of Babiti, a group of criminals fell upon manservants of the chief confectioner. The governor also informs the king about criminals from nearby Arapta and the province of the palace herald, who banded together with and were raiding and plundering. All this clearly shows that the gangs were able to communicate with one another and to merge into bigger groups, which in turn attracted outlaws from other provinces. The fact that they operated in the inaccessible regions of the Zagros Piedmont made this easier to accomplish because fugitives often found safe haven in the mountains. The situation must have been tense since Sargon insisted that Samas Belu-ur capture the criminals. On his part, the governor took countermeasures by commanding troops to keep watch on the unfolding situation. This action resulted in capturing some of the criminals from the house of the chief judge. Some members of the gang acted openly in a brazen way, not even trying to hide their identities. Such behavior, Dadi, a high official of the Ashur temple in Ashur, writes to Assur-Haddon or Assur-banipal that 2 shepherds who had become criminals formed together with 10 other offenders, an armed gang. Dadi complained to the king, "They do not fear the king. They rove about like runaways," and he added that they threatened everyone who dared to oppose them. "Whoever comes against us, we will cut down with our bows," a typical modus operandi of criminals whose only way to survive was collective cooperation, despite the fact that they may have come from various social backgrounds, and their reasons of escape varied from person to person. We cannot exclude that some of them were deserters from the army who potentially could in the future become mercenaries.